This is the Creative Life Show, celebrating being highly creative in a less creative world. I'm Joanna Peters, coach and mentor to professional creatives and creative professionals. And I talk to other creatives, innovators and thinkers about how we create, face down our critics, stay on track, get noticed and paid, and do the work we want to do. And I'm sharing the progress of my own book, all about creative people and how we thrive. Hello, welcome. It's the week of the 10th of September, and I've been loving the energy in the air this week, and particularly getting back to work on my book. So I've done quite a lot of reading over the summer, but not much writing, and now I'm going through the notes I've made. One thing I really struggle with is keeping tags on my research. I don't know about you, but I read these amazing things and have these great ideas, and it's so easy for them to get lost. So I've been experimenting with various different online systems. But you know what? I've just been finding a pencil and Post-its and longhand notes as I go is really helpful. And I've even started writing in books, which is something has taken me years to do. The key thing, of course, is going through those notes. And that's what I've been doing. So doing a kind of filtering and deciding what's going to go in where things belong in my book, or what things are sparking off new ideas or directions for research. If you follow me on Instagram, where I'm Joanna Peters 1, you'll have seen me doing some of that. And if you're not, come and join me on there. If you're not quite on top of where you want to be this September, a quick reminder of the Creatives Distraction Buster. It's one of the free downloads on my website, and it's 5 ways to get your creative brain focused on whatever it is you need to achieve. Come to creativelifeshow.com or joannapeters.com and just follow the links. My guest today is one of the least distracted and most productive people I have come across. Get a pen because you're going to want it. Hello and welcome. Today my guest is Dworkin, violinist, social entrepreneur, academic and philanthropist. He's a MacArthur Fellow, which is known as the Genius Awards, and he was President Obama's first appointment to the National Council on the Arts. Newsweek listed him as one of the 15 people who make America great, and his list of awards and speaking engagements goes on for pages. So I first crossed paths with Erin about 20 years ago, and I was a young music journalist and Erin was a graduate violin student. And I think he sent me a press release about launching an organisation called the Sphinx. Erin was acutely aware of the lack of musicians like him. So he's biracial, so Black or Latino musicians on concert platforms, and he decided to do something about it. The Sphinx organisation started out as a competition, but one which always had support and mentoring at the heart of it. And I suspect that neither he nor I anticipated quite what an impact it would have. Today, it has 50 people on its staff, gives out $1 million of funding every year, and has had an extraordinary impact on diversity in classical music and education and the awareness of it. But that's just one part of Erin's story. He's handed over the reins of the Sphinx and became Dean of the School of Music, Theatre and Dance at the University of Michigan, which is one of the US's big arts colleges. And although he's now stepped down from that role, he still teaches creative leadership and entrepreneurship there, subjects which he's really passionate about. He writes and performs poetry. His first science fiction novel is out, and he fronts a weekly online creative advice show. Erin, welcome to the Creative Life Show. You were a violinist from the age of 5, but how far is being a musician still important to your creative life?
You know, at the cornerstone, certainly, I think of still everything I do is, if you will, projecting my voice as an artist. So while for many years that was through the medium of my violin, I reached this very unique point, and it was within the first year of Sphinx's actual programming. And I was wrestling, as many kind of budding artists, entrepreneurs do, do I spend time practicing? Do I work more on this project? And I was going back and forth. And of course, I think like any good musician, feeling guilty about not practicing. And I came to this epiphany that Sphinx had become my primary instrument. And that kind of had a big effect on me in this sense of freeing me to have this become my priority. So while it's become my priority in a variety of other projects that, if you will, are in more of an administrative or entrepreneurship realm, I've always had to maintain some type of performing, some type of creation of art that I'm sharing with others. I just feel driven to do that. And so while that was for many years on violin, now in more recent years, that has taken its form with spoken word art, with classical music, and also my writing.
Well, that's something I wanted to come back to later because it really struck me that maybe words are the form it takes now. So it sounds as though it was clear early on that Sphinx was going to take over from the violin.
Yes, absolutely. And I've really always looked at the organization as an instrument. I approach it like I approached my practicing, and there are aspects of the work that are scales and etudes, and there are aspects that are, that ultimate joy of being on stage and sharing your ideas, your thoughts, your emotions with others. So I really always have approached it as a creative process.
Gosh, I love that analogy to practicing, and it's not something I've ever thought of, to be fair, but it makes complete sense. Of course, music, like almost nothing else, has got those hours and hours of graft and mastering your craft, hasn't it, before the performance?
And very similarly, too, when people look at an organization or they come to a program, they see, just like in a performance, only that tiny snapshot of all of the work that went into it. You go to a concert you might have produced as an administrator, and people see that, but they don't realize the months of work that went in beforehand. So it's the same way. And, and fundraising often can be equated with scales, that grueling behind the scenes work that without which you could never play the piece. And so the fundraising without which you could actually never have the organization.
We talked just before we started recording about the story you were going to share with us, and I know it's related to that. So, as with all my guests, I asked you to share a story of a particular creative challenge. So take us through yours.
So, well, as many young entrepreneurs face, and I think especially artist entrepreneurs, in the early days of Sphinx, I had this very clear idea of what I wanted to do, building this competition. But I, of course, had no funding. And not only did I have no funding, I really didn't know anyone with money. And so I just had to try and figure out, how do I reach out across the board? And a couple of things happened there. And the one key one is that I was like, well, who has money? And so I realized, and I had learned, that the president of the World Bank at the time, James Wolfenson, was a cellist. So I was like, who has more money than the president of the World Bank? So I just wrote him a letter. And of course, this was among, 500 other letters that I wrote. But I wrote that letter, didn't really expect a response. And about a month and a half later, I got not even a regular business size envelope, but a half size envelope. So I assumed it was a quick rejection letter. And in it, it said, this sounds like a phenomenal idea. Here is a $10,000 gift from my family foundation. Go to it, do good work. This is a one-time contribution. And it was in that moment that I realized that Sphinx could actually become something real, something tangible beyond just a dream in my head. Until that point, I had it all figured out in terms of the plan. I was like, I know this could happen. I know this will work. I know it's so needed in our field. I just am driven to do this. But in that moment, I realized, oh my God, this can now actually happen.
You skated over the aside, the 500 on the other letters. But it sounds as, how long had you been working on that to get that off the ground?
Oh, it was about 9 months from, just developing the idea. I originally literally went into my violin lesson with my teacher, Steve Ships, and I said, I have an idea. And he was like, you didn't practice. And I said, correct, but it's really a good idea. And he listened, and he's like, put that down on paper and I will help you take it to the dean of our school of Michigan at the time where I went. And so I did put it on paper. We went to the school, and for that meeting, I was very key to actually not ask for money. And so, but what I did ask was for partnership. And I asked, would the school be a formal partner so that I could share that with other people? And would they give me space and faculty time in support of what I was building? And so I made it very hard for the school to say no. And of course, it was an amazing dean, Paul Boylan at the time, who said, sure, go to it. And I'm not sure if he thought whether I actually would be successful, but I made it a low enough risk that he could put those school resources behind it. And then that enabled me to go to others and say, support this partnership with the University of Michigan. So it brought a sense of stability, a sense of security to a project that was really at that point the idea of an undergraduate student.
I mean, that's enormously savvy as an undergraduate student. Where did that amount of clarity about getting support come from?
Well, I was driven by the purpose. I had gone into a lesson and my teacher had said, do you want to play music by Black composers? And up until that point, I didn't know there were any Black classical composers. And I said, how is that possible as a college student, as someone who's biracial? How could I have never known that there was this amazing music? And so it opened my eyes up to that. I would go to a concert at, our local orchestra, either the Ann Arbor Symphony or the Detroit Symphony, and rarely see anybody of color, not just on stage, but in the audience. And I thought, how is this the case with this art form that has meant so much to me and transformed my life? And so I felt incredibly driven that this is something I have to at least try to do something about, because I knew how powerful our art form is. And so it was that drive that compelled me to stay up till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, writing those letters, reading all of the rejections, getting all through all of that. I had a very clear vision in sight, and that made all of the repetition of all of those not just possible, but I was more than happy to do it. It's kind of like when you have this amazing piece you want to work on, but it's got these runs and you need to work through your exercises, your etudes, if you're really going to be able to tackle it. So even though there might be some repetition or drudgery to that, you have this clear sense in sight of, I want to be able to perform this whole piece.
Did you find yourself mentors or people with more experience in actually doing this kind of thing?
Absolutely critically important. Sphinx wouldn't exist. I certainly wouldn't have been able to do the vast majority of anything I have done in my life without mentors. And I would say, too, that it's really key to know that no one came to me and said, Aaron, you're such a wonderful young man. Let me be your mentor. Can I help you through, right? So I always tell, especially young people, that you make your mentors. I made every one of my mentors be my mentor. Lucky for me, they were open to that, but I had to go to them. I had to say, will you be my mentor? I had to be the one to call them. I had to be the one to reach out to them for that feedback, for that guidance. But from a very early time, that was the case, and they played an extraordinary role in my life.
So how many rejections had you had by the time this $10,000 check appeared in your mailbox?
Oh, literally more than I can count. And I mean, literally, certainly more than 100, for sure. But they didn't matter because I was like, this is part of this process. And one of the other key things that happened right after that, so that was this first key point, was that I learned that at the University of Michigan, in the central president's office, they had launched a new fund for diversity that was funded by the Kellogg Foundation. And it was really primarily for faculty projects and things like that. But I read about the program, and there was nothing that said that students couldn't apply technically. So I said, well, I think I should anyway. So I got a number of faculty support letters, but I did a major proposal to that fund. And from the president's office, I got a $40,000 grant, really for a program that was designed for faculty. And then it combined that with, of course, many, many rejections from local corporations. But thankfully, the Ford Motor Company and also the Masco Company came on board to support. And then also our local Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, which I reached out to, actually gave us at the time one of their largest grants. And it was the combination of those several places that provided all of the funding for the inaugural Sphinx competition.
And did you experience doubt in this? It's a huge thing that you're doing. You're saying, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to make this happen. Did you have moments of going, who am I to do this? Or how can I possibly make this happen? Or I've had 300 rejection letters.
Interestingly, no. I don't tend to, I guess, kind of wallow, I guess, in those type of sentiments. When I'm working on something, I feel driven towards it. So it's kind of like, when I first tackled playing Chaconne, when I was at the Interlochen Arts Academy, I didn't kind of think, oh, who am I to learn this piece? Or you just kind of feel driven, and it's about the work. It's about getting it done. And for me, especially the work of Sphinx was so important that I didn't really have the time, interest, or the luxury in kind of thinking about whether I should or whether I could do it. I was just really focused on trying to do it. And if I failed, I failed, but at least I would know that I tried.
That analogy you made with practice and setting up an organization, did that give you that kind of mindset of the work that needs to go into it? Or do you think that's inherent in you anyway?
I definitely think that those of us, especially who studied classical instruments, the rigor that goes into that, I do think it builds something. I've seen that in both of my sons as they both studied violin at an early age, that the approach, the rigor, I think gives you something that's applicable to many things in life. So I think it played a role. I do think that I have, for whatever reasons, kind of a level of persistence that I approach things with that enables me to kind of go back again and again to things. For example, the Masco Corporation, I originally reached out with a letter to the president of their foundation, and I got a standard response letter, which was, thank you, no, go away. And then I waited about a month or two, and then I sent another letter, and I said, I know you said no, but they took the time to send a rejection letter. And so I said, I know you said no, but we're really getting closer, and this is a really important project, and here's why I think it would be important to you guys. And I got another rejection letter, but this was, I realized, was a personalized rejection letter. It was, this seems like a nice program, but we're not in a position to support. And I was like, they took the time to actually personalize a rejection. That means there must be hope at some point in the future. And so literally a month later, I reached out again to this wonderful woman who led the foundation at the time, Lillian Bowder. And that third time she said, okay, come in for a meeting. Let's talk about this. And we talked, and they ended up being one of our key corporate sponsors, one of only two that year. And then both she personally and the company continued to support Sphinx for decades. And she then became also one of my biggest mentors. So that type of persistence is kind of how I've approached a host of different challenges.
And again, it's quite like music practice, it strikes me. You're going, well, I'm trying this. It's not quite working. I'm going to change my approach slightly and try again.
Absolutely.
What I find interesting is that Sphinx started out because you perceived yourself as an outsider. I mean, in many ways, you were an outsider. But by doing it, you've very much become part of an establishment. Does that present a challenge in the way you see yourself or the way you create?
Well, it's an interesting question because I actually don't see myself as kind of part of the establishment, if you will. I guess I've always seen myself as an outsider, outsider kind of in the sense of quote unquote the establishment, the traditional paths, traditional ways of doing something, right? So obviously I don't feel an outsider to the Sphinx organization itself or an outsider to the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. But I definitely always have felt like an outsider or a change agent or a catalytic agent to both those institutions, but certainly to the field itself. And I feel that to this day with the projects that I'm working on and also the entrepreneurship skill sets that I'm teaching and trying to prepare in our young people, many of which, unfortunately, I feel in our field are still seen as new, are seen as something that might be too cutting edge, that are sometimes seen as a distraction from the core rote training on one's instrument or primary discipline. So I definitely still see myself that way.
Because you're challenging and disrupting whatever it is that your organization you're working in.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, that might also just be part of my nature.
What Well, I'm wondering this because a lot of the people I work with, and particularly on this show, are people for whom actually being an outsider is essential to their work, because that's the only place we can sort of agitate from and challenge from and see, because that's the only way you can actually see other possibilities.
Yeah. And I would say, too, that I'm always interrogating our current reality. And I have, I would say, relatively brief patience for those who are unwilling to let their reality be interrogated, to let what has been done for however many years be questioned. And so I don't think we should just disrupt for disruption's sake or change for change's sake. But I absolutely think we should ask ourselves, okay, well, we've done this for 20 years. We shouldn't just blindly teach the same way for another 20 years. It is appropriate to ask ourselves, are we doing this in the best way, especially when it comes to young people? Are we serving them in the best way? Are we preparing them in the best way? And what we absolutely know, and we have a very, very comprehensive study that was done through SNAP, which has surveyed arts alums across the country, that we are not doing the best job preparing those who are entering into our creative fields. And we are not providing them the full range of skill sets that our alumni feel are important in the jobs that they carry on after they graduate.
Well, this is so important, isn't it? Because so many of the artistic disciplines, particularly performing arts, I think music is particularly guilty of this, see that as the only thing that we're striving towards. And all the other slightly dirty stuff is, yes, as you say, a bit of a distraction.
And what we know that's very interesting from these studies is from all arts alums that absolutely they feel their artistic skills and the educational skills that they got in school, about 75% or so of them feel that these are important for their current work. However, about 75% of them also feel that entrepreneurial skills are important to their current work. So in other words, our alumni value entrepreneurship skills preparation at the same level as their artistic skills preparation, and yet only 30% of them feel they got any preparation for that at the institutions that they went to. And in addition, they feel that problem-solving skills and leadership skills are more at 90%. So in other words, they feel those skill sets are higher, more important than the artistic skills. So it's interesting because I understand that perspective of, say a core teacher in our instrumental categories who was looking and saying, well, this is how I was trained. I know how to train someone to play this instrument at the highest level. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm here for. And anything else is a distraction. That's an understandable viewpoint. However, what we know factually is that that is not the best way to actually prepare a young person to have a career on that instrument today. They need additional skill sets to be able to do that. And so I look at that and I say, yes, that's great. We need to do that and we don't want to distract from that, but we must be additive to it.
So there are so many creatives who see the problems in the world, have an issue they really want to engage with, want to change. But the challenge of doing something about it is almost insurmountable in many cases. What I'm hearing from you, for you, it's about the purpose. It's about the sort of clarity of the message that you are giving at any one point. And it's about providing evidence.
Absolutely. You have to be able to, in kind of almost Aristotle's forms of persuasion, where you have ethos, logos, and pathos, right? So you have that ethos. You have to share with people, who are you? What's at your core? What is in your character, right? And then, very important, you have to share this logos. You have to share the logic, the reasoning, the facts behind what it is that you believe in and what your character is seeking. And then ultimately the pathos. You have to share and engage someone emotionally if they're going to care and feel passionately about what you do. So oftentimes I literally use that approach when I'm looking to say in the early days of Sphinx, say Sphinx as an organization, we can't just go and change this field. We have to partner. We have to build collaborations. So how can I go to this major orchestra and talk with them about this issue? How can I engage them in a way that is a true partnership, a true collaboration, and where they share this belief and passion for diversity and why it is factually and logically important for the best interests of their orchestra, the best interests of our art form. And that's how I approached that, and that's how Sphinx built what is now over 100 partners, artist organization partners around the world.
I love that clarity because it's such an antidote to the so much creative education, which has been about the expression as everything. and it doesn't work if you want to get your message out to a wider audience, a wider world.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we always have to, look at the audience we're speaking to and understand where are they coming from? What are their priorities? I don't think I could have gone very far at all working on diversity if I just spoke about it from my own perspective. I had to look and say, where is this orchestra coming from? Where is this professional who's been in the field for 30 years and is focused on what their understanding of artistic excellence is, and they see the idea of diversity as a threat to what they actually hold sacrosanct in their art form? How can I carry on a conversation with this person where they will be open to hearing these ideas? So you really have to think about who you're talking with and where they're coming from.
Let's go back to words, because you touched on words as being your performance vehicle these days. And that's really the way you're communicating with those orchestras. So you don't just do speeches, you don't just fundraise, you do those hugely successfully. You also write poetry, you perform poetry, and you've written a science fiction novel. Are words where you go to escape as well? That's the impression I would get from that.
Yeah, I think definitely so. And probably not just even, if you will, the assembly of words into, strings of dialogue that can connect with someone else, but also the delivery of words. So I really like the use of spoken word and the ability to use the articulation of words, shaping words with music. I feel that I'm able to do that in a way that can capture a setting. So, for example, when I was adopted when I was 2 weeks old by a white Jewish couple, and that's who raised me. And when I was 13, I visited Dachau, the concentration camp in Germany outside of Munich. And that experience was incredibly impactful on me in trying to understand being perceived as Black, even though I'm biracial and Jewish through my adoption and all of these things. And so I wrote a poem about that. So then I took that poem and scored it with Barber's Adagio, of course, an incredibly evocative piece. And then I used visual imagery from the camp. And so in that way, I'm able to create a piece and take a moment and about 8 or 9 minutes with an audience and bring them into that moment of a 13-year-old as the gravel crunched beneath my feet, walking through the camp and seeing the ovens and feeling fear. And there's a way that you can use that spoken word combined with classical music, combined with imagery, that I find can have a profound effect on an audience. And I love shaping those types of artistic expressions.
Is your poetry written to be performed?
Great question. So some of it is where I actually sit down with the intent that it is to be performed. And then I do have some poetry that I didn't initially write to be performed, and that either I have never performed or some that wasn't intended to be that way, but then I have ended up actually performing it. So I have a host of different types of poetry that I've written. And I actually originally started this process by actually not using my own poetry, but using existing poetry. So what I wanted to do was show how the artistry from one time period and one culture could be combined with the artistry from a different time period and culture to create a unified artistic expression. So I started by taking Paul Laurence Dunbar, Langston Hughes' poetry, and combining it with Western classical music to create these singular artistic expressions. So that's actually how I began to go down this path. And then from that, I began using some of my poetry, and then I actually began writing my own poetry specifically to create new work.
And where does the science fiction come from? I mean, what really strikes me is that people sort of write a novel, but I was okay, the novel, it's probably based some kind of arts background, because that's a typical pattern for people who start. Yours absolutely isn't. Yours is sort of futuristic science gaming kind of virtual reality thing, isn't it?
Yes. So And also, it's funny because people always say, oh, well, I can't do that. Or, well, I'm not really a writer or whatever. And I say, you really can do anything and at any period in your life. And actually, again, his quote from Aristotle was talking about excellence. He says, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. And we really are what we repeatedly do. And so if you continually do something, you are that. And so I have always been embedded and loved and grew up reading science fiction. And of course, watching Star Trek and Star Wars and all of that. And one of the big things that I've always loved about science fiction is that the authors use the medium of science fiction, the genre of science fiction, as a way to address diversity. And Star Trek especially did this and covered many areas of diversity on the show. And so I wanted to utilize this medium of virtual reality. One, just because I love science fiction and love technology and all of those things and love VR, but wanted to speak to issues of diversity through that medium, because often you can engage people instead of in a way that you can't if you just say, let's have a book about diversity. So I did, and the book entirely takes place in Detroit and Flint, Michigan. And diversity is literally embedded in the fabric of the story. And I thought to myself, I've loved science fiction my whole life. I have a whole host of science fiction ideas. I have this idea for this book, so why not try and write it? And what's the worst that can happen? So I set about, to discipline myself to actually go through a writing process and let myself be very open to feedback and editing and all of that type of stuff. So I've learned a lot, and it was a wonderful experience and is a really fun story, I think, too.
And you said feedback and experience. Did you find yourself mentors or people to support you through that process as well?
Oh, absolutely. Just like everything that I do in life, that type of guidance and feedback from others has always been critical. And now, actually, I've just been wrapping up my manuscript for my new book, which is a nonfiction, which is a book on entrepreneurship called The Art of Entrepreneurship. And so I'm very excited about that. And hopefully we'll be releasing that at some point in the next year, depending on how our engagement goes with publishers. So
you quote Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. You seem to be trying lots of different things. Is that what you repeatedly do? You experiment and you challenge yourself?
Oh, absolutely. So never in my life have I only been doing one thing. And actually, a thing that I teach my students is how to very intentionally have a portfolio life, which most of us in the creative space end up having portfolio lives, but often it's unintentional. And people end up doing some of this. They end up doing some maybe orchestral performing, some chamber music, some teaching, some other work. People do different things. So I encourage them to actually very intentionally build a portfolio life, and where you have certain priorities associated with the things you do. You understand where your income is going to come from so that you're not left, kind of high and dry without knowing how to keep a roof over your head, and a host of different things. And so I definitely have always had that portfolio life, and probably even more so now than ever before, even in the past.
What is there on your to-do list of things you'd love to do in, say, in the next 5 years?
Well, definitely this book, of course, and entrepreneurship book. And I want to really hopefully be able to take that and continue that and further that. Also, my speaking and being able to engage with audiences, both in terms of presentations about our field and creativity and entrepreneurship and diversity, but then also my artistic work. One thing I would love to be able to do that I have not done yet is to be able to do my spoken word with a major symphony orchestra in a major hall. I've been able to do it with some smaller regional orchestras. I would love to be able to do some of my spoken word with a major orchestra. And I think most importantly, I am really looking forward to seeing the entrepreneurial projects and creativity that the students that I teach bring to bear. One of the things I tell my students is, even though for most of them I'm just with them for one semester, is I say, this is just the beginning. I will always be a resource here for you, always be here for you, and as you go forth. And so I'm in touch with many of my students, even after they not only finish my class, but after they graduate. And they're beginning to launch some incredible projects. And I see how they're going to become leaders in our field. And seeing that just brings an unbelievable sense of fulfillment and joy. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing that.
Lots to watch this space for. Aaron, where can people connect with you?
Oh, they can absolutely check out my website, aarondworkin.com, but also at my site for the weekly creative mentoring show that's free and sign up and there's no ads or anything, which is aaronask.com. And then I welcome people to reach out to me directly. And my email is maverickviolin. My nickname is Maverick. And so my email is maverickviolin@gmail.com.
I can't think of a more appropriate email address. I will put all those links up on the creativelifeshow.com website alongside Aaron's Twitter and Instagram and other social media contacts. Aaron, thank you so much for coming on and sharing that. And thank you all for listening. So just a reminder, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Creative Life Show on iTunes or your podcast app. And come and leave me your address at creativelifeshow.com and I will email you about every new episode as it goes live. So have a wonderfully creative week and I'll see you back here soon.